Cast from your mind a picture of data centers as a series of bland steel boxes clustered on the edge of a trading estate. This is a sector driving a modern-day industrial revolution across the UK. Local authorities are welcoming the data center operator into their community for their halo effect: jobs, training, wealth. What does this mean for the data center industry? How do we quantify the value they bring? And can we extend this to how they support net zero communities? To shine a light on why data centers matter and explore how we can capture and reuse their waste heat to sustainably fuel the energy demands of local communities, I'm joined by James Donagh, Development Economics Director for Stantec, assessing the economic case for development opportunities across the UK, and Stephen Meleady, an MEP Director with Stantec and our lead on mission-critical facilities. And later, we have an exclusive interview with Emma Fryer, Director of Public Policy for Europe for CyrusOne, a large-scale co-location developer and operator of data centres. So stay with us for that. I'm Graham Monday. Welcome to The Scope, a podcast from Stantec, a global leader in sustainable engineering, architecture, and environmental consulting. Stephen, data centres have quite recently been classified as critical national infrastructure by the government, and the message from government is loud and clear, and we need more of them. In terms of where these facilities can be built, that's quite a complex question, but does it mean that the industry is looking beyond the usual places, the reference I made at the start, business parks and rural areas maybe? How big a change is this?
I think there's a lot of change happening in the industry currently. There's a lot of engagement with a wider stakeholder group. We're seeing a lot of change and reform from a planning perspective. Keir Starmer announced the recent AI Opportunities Action Plan, which is a bold roadmap towards putting the UK as a global lead in terms of AI, and we're going to see billions of pounds worth of investment in the sector as a result of that. But moving forward, I think there's a different approach. You know, some people have likened this boom and this growth similar to the logistics space, but I think people need to realize that it's very different. There's very different requirements. So we might be building large grey boxes, but there's large power requirements, there's large connectivity requirements, and we don't have the same sort of traffic flow in and out of these sites that the logistics spaces are used to. So we need a different approach to these type of buildings. We need to be more innovative in terms of our architecture to hide the extent of plant that goes with these buildings. So it's going to be interesting moving forward to watch the industry change and adapt to these requirements. But I think as a whole, there's huge opportunity for local community and the country, which I'm sure James will touch on today.
Yeah, so let's unpack some of that now, particularly starting with the economic growth aspect, James, as well. You know, that's kind of why the government is backing this so strongly. What might come as a surprise to people is a relatively small number of people work in one of these buildings, but the impact is much greater than that, isn't it? Talk us through some of that.
Yes, that's right. It is, okay, it's critical national infrastructure, it's critical economic infrastructure. It's not just about the data center itself, it's about the growth that enables nationally and regionally. Tech UK, in their recent evaluation, said that almost every job in the UK is reliant on a data center. They said that it is the backbone of the UK economy, and in fact, many sectors simply couldn't function without it. That's how important it is. So wealth creation, jobs, productivity, all enabled by data centers in the context of the UK suffering from a significant flatlining of productivity over the last decade or so. And whilst a data center might employ, say, 90 people directly, there are hundreds of jobs involved in construction and fit out of those data centers, often over several years. There are demands on mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, people who understand Internet of Things, project managers, designers, etc. So it is supporting jobs across the economy and it is enabling growth of the UK economy. And that's the key, and that's the message we need to get as clearly understood as possible.
Mm. And if I can put you on the spot there slightly, do we have some numbers that we can put to any of that in terms of examples?
Yes. So research tells us that a data center can contribute. A new data center can contribute about 470 million GVA per annum. So we would say typically that's a 50 megawatt data center, say one building over about 50,000 square meters. And it would support, apart from the 90 jobs within the data center itself, a few hundred jobs in the local area because of people working there, buying services, produce, etc., locally in restaurants and such like. But then the real prize is the 5,000 or so jobs across the wider economy in a range of different sectors, such as financial services, professional services, ICT, media broadcasting, etc. So it's supporting vast amounts of the economy, and that reflects the Tech UK view of the world.
And in some of the work you've done as well, have local authorities in particular begun to understand this as well and recognise this? I think we're recording this in the spring of 2025. There's already been a couple of interesting news stories from the Northeast and more recently Anglesey about potential data centres and data centres coming. And you got the sense from the interviews that the local authorities have recognised the value that this can actually bring to their economy.
Yes, I think a couple of years ago there was fear and concern that data centers were displacing other activities, and I think two things have happened. Firstly, there's an understanding that this is the new economy, and that actually it isn't displacing anything. It's where the economy is going, and there's an appreciation of the wider impacts on the economy and the significance of the effects on local areas as well. So other industries, very productive industries that tend to cluster around areas with a lot of data centers, and the opportunities for younger people in particular to improve their skills, gain qualifications, and ultimately work in that with those operators in the data centers or for them.
I mean, when we talked, I remember offline about this, we talked about actually it's quite a highly skilled, quite highly paid jobs relate to this as well, and a local area can benefit from that, hotel rooms, etc., in terms of people coming in, needing to stay, all of these things bolstering the economy.
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly during the construction phase, there's a lot of people, and the fit out stage, there's a lot of people coming to site from a consultancy perspective, engineers, commissioning, installers, and in large numbers. Those people need places to stay, to eat, and that brings a lot of generation to the local economy.
Learning and skills as well. If one of you can touch on that for me too. The operators themselves are investing quite a lot in that, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And there's a very good example in West London. University Technical College Heathrow offers a digital futures program for students year 10 to 13, so 14 years up. They're there to engage in a BTEC level 3 or A levels in becoming engineers to work in data centers, but the program is delivered by operators and placements are available with operators. So students are going through that program, they're getting first-hand experience from operators, learning about mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, etc. And then they're going on to do higher qualifications, and the evidence is showing that after that, they're getting into those jobs within those operators. So, and I think it's the investment in the time, people from those operators actually going in there and teaching year 10s is fascinating and fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of the investment from large co-location providers and clients, but there's also a huge amount of investment from training from consultancies, builders, and other stakeholders in the industry. One of the advantages that we have is there's a lot of people that are seeing the growth of AI and the mission critical space, and it's a real attractive prospect for a lot of people. So we can lean on that from a consultancy perspective, upskilling our engineers in the DC space. We might have a large pool of engineers that are non-DC, and there's a huge opportunity to train them and upskill them. And speaking with other people in the industry, project managers, architects, everyone sees that as a huge opportunity, and there's a lot of investment, time, and training being spent on that.
Okay, this is a really interesting part of the conversation, which is dispelling myths. Maybe I don't know, but just helping, I think, people to understand why data centers is such an important market and sector, and the value that it's bringing in terms of these types of operations being closer to communities. If I can move us on into another aspect of what they potentially can deliver to communities, and to Stephen, I'm gonna come to you here with your particular expertise. I want to turn the attention a bit to the net zero agenda. There is a lot of talk, probably because it's quite easy to say these things about the potential to use the waste heat, and examples of data centers being able to heat the local swimming pool, and we potentially could see this at a much larger scale. Can they power our homes, for example, in the future? Where is that going? We talked at the start of this episode about net zero communities. What's the journey look like?
Well, I think from a heat export perspective, it's a popular topic. It's on the agenda in a lot of discussions. Unfortunately, in the UK, it hasn't been quite successful. It has been in other areas on the continent. In the UK, we've had a lot of challenges associated with heat export. Many of the new sites, as standard, are including heat export provisions. So they'll include space on the site and the infrastructure to allow heat export off the site. With the AI increase in rack density, there's even more of an opportunity to export heat from the site with larger capacity required for cooling, and obviously that could facilitate homes, leisure centers, amenities, and there's a massive opportunity there. The challenge historically is the clusters of data centers that we've currently got in the UK, and Slough Trading Estate being one of them, is a good example of that. And there's many others. And the master planning and the foresight associated with the development of those areas hasn't really tied into the heat export piece. So there's a lot of work to be done there. The barriers include the distance from the heat generation on the facility to the heat user, uh, sometimes quite large distances, which require quite a lot of excavation, quite a lot of work, and quite a lot of cost. The other thing is that it requires a heat export third party to invest in that, plan that infrastructure, and build it and operate it. And the conversations haven't quite been there on that front.
So then, if I may continue to pick at this with you, then if we take the cluster sites to one side and say, well, look, there's a historic aspect, that's how they've always been. But we look at some of the newer sites coming forward and where they're positioned, and people talking about them being closer to communities.
Mm.
Presumably, that opportunity starts to open up. However, your point is then it's about a series of different stakeholders needing to engage.
Yeah, I think there's another chance to take advantage of those opportunities, but there needs to be the right conversations happening at the right time. A lot of it is to do with timing. There is large cluster facilities now being built in new areas, but there needs to be the engagement with the users of that heat. An example of that could be a large residential development, which could be a few blocks away, but it's ensuring that there's the right incentives in place, discussions in place between those operators to ensure that they can take advantage of that. The London GLA have a heating hierarchy that forces these developments to look at district heat networks as an example. That might be something that might be worth looking at from a heat export perspective to try and put some pressure back onto the developers. But ultimately, the large hyperscale operators are not going to be swayed to select the site based on its ability to heat export. So we all need to work with them to make sure that the sites that tick all the remaining boxes are suitable for heat export to other users.
Do we sense that a number of these other stakeholders recognize the opportunity that is there and the importance of talking and collaborating? James, I'm looking at you as well here.
I think increasingly so. Yes, in terms of planning, there's a much better understanding and acknowledgement of the wider benefits, which would include all of these things that we've been discussing. And the fact that national policy is now promoting data centers in the way that it is as key drivers of growth and developments that should be encouraged. I think that all helps. Whether it can get over those final hurdles that Stephen was describing is another question, but it gets you further along that road.
Yeah, I would have thought from a community, local council perspective, they would be more engaged. Third-party heat exporter will be engaged if it's a viable solution for them. I think the challenge is bringing in the users of the heat, and making sure that they're engaged. Residential developments, commercial developments, community developments. We need to engage with those stakeholders.
Okay, that's undoubtedly the next stage of that journey, isn't it? What other benefits can the partnership between data centers and local communities bring? What opportunities are we or should we be exploring? And I'm thinking about renewable power as well here.
Yeah, I think there's been a huge push towards renewable energy from a site selection perspective, from a lot of clients. There's a lot of clients are seeing a lot of value now in that. Historically, there's been a lot of clients have engaged in power purchaser agreements, with energy providers where they will negotiate a power purchaser agreement based on the percentage of green energy that they're going to receive on their site. And this is a real positive step in the right direction in terms of using renewable energy on these sites. But there's always challenges with what percentage of the grid is green, what percentage of it is being facilitated with fossil fuels. So whilst that is a positive step, we're certainly seeing clients looking to a preference of being located in close proximity to renewable energy sources. And DC Blythe is a good example of this, where they're in close proximity to the offshore wind incomer. And I think we'll start to see more and more of this moving forward as the hyperscale developers, co-location providers favor sites that are closer to renewable sources.
James, do you have any final thoughts as well in terms of where this sector is going?
Yes, Stephen mentioned Blythe, the DC campus there, and I think that's very recently been consented. 10 billion investment, 540,000 square meters, AI training, machine learning. The effect that will have on regeneration is a really interesting area. And I think that is one to watch. So the move out of London and the southeast into some of these very large scale developments and the potential effect, whether that turns into reality. And Dan Byrne is from Blythe, and he scored that first goal for Newcastle that ended 70 trophyless years. So I wonder whether Blythe itself can benefit in much the same way from this new development. So that's one I'll be watching.
That sounds to me like a perfect conclusion to the conversation with the pair of you, indeed. So thank you to James Donagh and Stephen Meleady for your contribution to this. We now turn to an interview with Emma Fryer. Hello, Emma. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We've been discussing the unique requirements of data centers when it comes to deciding where and how we build them. What are you thinking at CyrusOne in terms of where you're looking at the expansion of this industry and also its integration with local communities?
So the two are very closely interrelated. There's two main areas of growth. Firstly, obviously, there's the AI, explosion in AI that we're seeing, but actually in Europe, we're not expecting to be hosting huge AI workloads because they will be chasing cheap power. Cheap renewable power, and that's not available really at the moment in Europe. However, conventional cloud, there's massive scope for continual growth, and that is somewhat hooked to existing locations, at least partially. So I think there's two different things. In one case, if we do end up with AI workloads, they will be in new locations, not the clusters we're familiar with. Conventional cloud will be in the cluster we're familiar with. Either way, those facilities are getting bigger. They're getting more noticeable. They're no longer in industrial estates. They're in semi-rural or actually urban residential, or maybe in the middle of communities that have never hosted them before. And therefore, you can't go along landing something the size of the Starship Enterprise somewhere, in those kind of locations and expect people not to notice. So that leads to us having a completely different conversation with our host communities.
Okay, thank you. And we've also discussed at some length the incredible value of this industry to the UK, to local communities, local regions, etc. That's not necessarily always obvious to people, and that probably builds on what you've just been talking about, actually. That's a big part of your role, isn't it? Why is there that perception gap, and what can we do about it?
So why it's there, I think, is quite easy to understand. Firstly, we started as an industry that was all about disaster recovery. So secrecy was important. You weren't going to say, hey, we're the disaster recovery site for the stock exchange. That doesn't help you. That doesn't help you. Secondly, as mentioned before, we've tended to build in sort of obscure parts of industrial parks and trading estates. And also, we've tended to build up to edge of site and had big fences, and it all looks a bit like an inverted prison. We don't have names on the outside. That's the sort of tradition of the industry. So you can't really expect people to understand what's going on inside. And often they become quite speculative. You know, if you do this inverted prison and make yourself look very secretive, they'll assume you're making death rays or something. And then also, I think we perform an incredibly important function, but we've done it gradually. It's been privately funded. You've never had to see great government, HS2 type initiatives, public funding raising initiatives. It's all been done privately. So that's happened very quietly. And I think the other thing, which is obviously fingers crossed, is that unlike some other utilities, like maybe water and power occasionally when under huge stress, we haven't publicly failed hugely. And big failure, say you can't supply 350,000 people with water for 2 weeks, you have a very interesting conversation with government about that if that happens, and everybody's aware of it. So the fact that we haven't failed, we've kept stuff going, we kept stuff going through COVID, we keep stuff going, it's what we do, and therefore people sort of don't notice and take us for granted. And I think there's also a sense we don't do anything useful. We do, but again, because it's sort of invisible. So I think those are the perception problems. In terms of what we do, saying is much easier than doing, because we have to raise awareness. We have to ensure people understand who we are, what we do. And then when we get to site, we need to, and I do it as three things: ask, listen, act. We have to ask people, what they need from us. We have to engage with them, listen to what they say, and then we actually have to deliver. So there's a whole load of things we can do. A huge list, in fact. So we can talk about that later. But there's many small things as well. We can't necessarily add a new junction to the M40, but what we can do is make sure our hoardings are attractive. We can manage, construction traffic flows. There's lots and lots of things we can do.
It's quite interesting, actually, how this industry has changed over time, isn't it? As you've said, from a sort of disaster recovery mode through to actually enabling the economy as such now. And I wanted to delve just slightly deeper into that perception gap, if that's okay. I know that you've published some fascinating research, which I think our listeners will be quite surprised by. I wonder if you can just give us some headlines on that in terms of people's perception of this industry.
Absolutely. We interviewed 13,000 people across our 7 European markets. And we split it by country, by age demographic, and also by whether you lived near a data center or not. And the really interesting thing was that people were far less negative about data centers than the media would have us believe. So 93% of them were either neutral or positive about data centers, and neutrality and positivity was about split, but only 7% were actually negative. That was encouraging, but on the other hand, and this comes back to our previous point, public awareness was really low. Barely 50% of people could identify the right definition of a data center out of a choice of 5. In the UK, that was the lowest in Europe at 38%, which is really worrying. And then there was a very low ability of people to be able to associate the digital services and apps they use every day, all the time, with data centers, with in fact any physical infrastructure. And the age demographic that was least likely to be able to associate, the apps they use every day with physical infrastructure, with a 16 to 24 age group, which I thought was fascinating. And I wonder if it's they never had to do dial-up. I don't know. And we asked a group of students a couple of weeks ago why they thought that might be, and they said, well, no one ever told us. And it's not something that appears on a bill. You don't get an internet bill in the same way you get a water bill, do you? Really, you pay through your phone, so you don't see it in that way.
Absolutely, you just expect it. It's just got to be there.
Yeah, and I think it tells us some quite important things, actually. Yeah.
And the heavy lifting as well. I know you got a bit of an analogy with roads, if you like, haven't you, as well?
Yes, I think it's true. I think there's a lack of understanding of just how important data centers are they're not just to allow people to upload videos of themselves teaching their dogs to tap dance. They run the economy, as you say. And I think we have to think of data centers as infrastructure, not as data storage, but as digital infrastructure in the same way that roads or railways are infrastructure. And then we shouldn't perhaps expect a huge amount of direct employment that you see from a supermarket, because you don't actually want infrastructure to employ lots of people all the time. You imagine the M1 covered in roadworks the whole time, employing lots of people all the time doing stuff. No, I mean, yes, they're eye-wateringly expensive to build, just like any other infrastructure. But the main direct employment is in construction. And then the value of that is in terms of productivity, in terms of efficiency, and also data centers have an absolutely colossal and very, very high value supply chain, value chain, both directions. That's often overlooked because they're not on payroll, they're indirect.
Yes, and we've covered that a little bit in this episode already. In the time that we have with you, let's just also touch on, from your perception as well, how these operators can get involved in local community projects as well, the importance of that.
It's absolutely critical, I think. I think there's a number of things we can do. As sites get bigger, you can make them more penetrable. You see these sites in industrial parks, you don't have any extra space. You have to come to edge of site. But if you buy a very big site, you can be creative about design. You can put your data center. Now, planners are quite happy for you to do a 4-story data center if it allows amenity space around it. Now, obviously, there's a cost benefit, but you can do that. You can create green routes. You can create amenities. I can't begin to tell you how many berms we've designed into our data center landscaping to allow different sort of drainage levels and biodiversity. So those things, and they're not hugely difficult to do. Other things are engaging with local schools, doing outreach. We're designing into one data center a whole affordability workspace for local businesses. We're doing a training center, lots and lots of public amenity. We're we can regenerate areas because you can do that when you've got a big project. And I think the two-way communication is really important, and a lot of it is it's very simple. One of the communities in Bucks, they were very interested in when there's a couple of buildings being demolished. Can we have the bricks? They're heritage bricks. Of course you can have the bricks. So I'm going on a brick safari, would you call it? A brick safari with the councillors around the site so they can tell us which bricks they want to retain. And those are very small things, but actually they're really, really material in how you engage and ensure that people have agency. They're not just sort of frustrated bystanders as something rolls along, a big project rolls along. That's absolutely key.
And if I may, just one final question in the time that we have. Sustainability and net zero are obviously hugely important, and we spoke with Stephen and James earlier about waste heat. They explained the challenges, some of the hopes for the future. It sounds like there's a lot that needs to fall into place for that. What's your perspective? What can we expect to see?
I think we can expect to see a more integrated approach, because it has to happen, and we're pushing from both sides. And I think, in terms of joining the dots between the heat producer and the heat off-taker, there has to be a network in between, and neither of those two are likely to be able to be in a position to put that in place. So we're happy to provide waste heat to site. It's designed in, as others have done. There are off-takers, but that has to be the connection has to be right. They have to be nearby. So it's actually it looks like a complete no-brainer in an urban environment. But even then, it's not simple. I think OPDC, it's Old Oak Common, they
Yes.
have, I think, got theirs going. So that will be a fantastic template for others to work on, because there's, it's certainly an urban site. They've got a number of data centers contributing heat, and they've got off-takers. That's been a very heavy lift. I mean, I was there at the beginning of it, trying to convene the operators, so I know. But I think it's about, in other countries, what you see is that the heat network is actually a municipal provision, and then other people are obliged or not to connect into it. Government's thinking really carefully about this. They're introducing this heat network zoning program, and I suspect that there'll be certainly, there has to be some form of perhaps grant or DESNZ involvement to join those dots and make sure that works, because otherwise it will be such a waste.
Well, that sounds really encouraging, Emma. That sounds like there is a direction of travel there that hopefully we will get to that place where we're making the most of that. And Old Oak Common, certainly, as you say, is a very well-known, high-profile site. So that would be a great case study in itself. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today. Very much appreciated your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to The Scope on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find all of our episodes on the Stantec website.